So next up, we have Tucker Carlson calling out in his recent podcast. The Obamas, the Clintons, you name it, he calls them out. It's unbelievable. And this once again feeds into my thesis that similarly to the 15th century church, which was corrupted beyond comprehension, it was corrupted, bureaucratic, priests engaging in prostitution, indulgences being sold at a huge sum, and mass control of the church over the general populace, including land, agriculture, commerce, you name it. Similarly, we see the same thing today, wherein the new dynamics of technology, previously in the 15th century, it was the printing press, which shifted the dynamics of power, wherein no longer the church had a monopoly upon information, but instead this was disseminated and thus led to a revolution. Similarly, today, I think you can really see the same parallels. We have this overwhelming populist type consensus in which there is this undercurrent that things are not working the way in which they should. And technology has facilitated these changes. For instance, the atomization of the firm through dynamics such as this, wherein the media companies no longer have a mass monopoly upon information, but instead we can transact and communicate in differing ways. This is interesting, and I'll speak about that later on. So let's listen to this clip of Tucker talking about Michelle Obama and Barack Obama and our corrupt elite politicians. Let's listen to this. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Because once you admit it out loud, then you realize there are, massive benefits to it, but there are also massive obligations to it. They're shirking their duty.
That's right.
That's what they're actually doing.
And that's actually the opposite of being noble. It's fraudulent.
It's disgusting.
Yes, and it's a lie. Your whole thing is based on a lie.
Disgusting.
It's Sam Bankman-Fried.
Of course.
Right? Oh, I just drive like a shitty little Toyota. It's like, oh, actually, you're defrauding.
Michelle Obama goes to Princeton for free.
Yeah.
And has been in the ruling class her whole life.
Yeah.
And she's still lecturing you about how she's a victim of racism. Hillary Clinton, exact same thing. Goes to Wellesley, spends her entire life in the ruling class, and she's still whining about how she's discriminated against. Why are they doing that?
Yeah. And did you ever see, they'll have like pictures of side by side, but it'll be like pictures of like Jimmy Carter's house and Obama's house.
Exactly.
And it totally represents something about the like corroding of our soul. That you're like, we would allow people who call themselves public servants, which of course is ridiculous, they're not, but still they don't even have to pretend to keep up a facade of that. Like you get to live in this insane like mansion off what? Because you were president and you get to cash in on that now?
In a white neighborhood, you should be required to live in the hood if you're Barack Obama. And if you're
using that card.
You use that card. The only reason you got elected was because of your race. You spent your entire 8 years inflaming race hate in our country. And then you go to Martha's Vineyard, the whitest zip code in the world? Not allowed. Yeah. You're not allowed to do that.
Well, it also, I mean, it did so much damage. His inflaming racial hatred. And I'll say after, Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, first of all, it was just leaving how you feel about the guy aside. It was an amazing campaign. It was unlike anything that had ever been run before.
It was genius.
Yes, it was totally brilliant. It was now, of course, it wasn't what they presented it as. It wasn't like a grassroots campaign. He was approved of by the powers that be. He didn't just happen to, as a junior senator, get like a primetime speaking slot in 2004 where he gave that speech.
He wasn't even a senator yet.
Was he a state senator still at the time?
That's when I first met Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Walking down the street, smoking a cigarette in Boston on my way to dinner at the Palm. I'll never forget it. And I met him and Jesse Jackson Jr. They pulled over to say hi to me. Really? I'd never heard his name, and I covered politics for a living.
Right.
And he gave the keynote at the end of that week. That was Sunday night. He spoke on Thursday. And he was not a U.S. senator. Right. That was the campaigin. It was great. It was absolutely crazy.
So it was clearly kind of orchestrated by some powerful people.
By the Pritzker family, of course.
But listen, the speeches that he gave, and much of the message, first off, there's probably a lot of things that I would have agreed with him that he was running on. I agreed with a lot of things George W. Bush ran on in the year 2000.
Well, I'll tell you what I agreed with.
They turned around and didn't govern like that at all.
Let's sort of like elect the black guy and get past the race stuff. I loved that.
Well, especially because that was his message.
That was his message.
And let's get past the race stuff.
I love that.
He goes, there was a broader, more unifying thing. I mean, I remember because he was such a powerful, like public speaker. I mean, he never really said anything, but it would still be beautiful.
Yes.
Like, I remember in his acceptance speech at 2008 at the DNC, we had this whole line where he was like, He was like, I love this country, and so do you, and so does John McCain. The men and women who have fought for this country have been Republicans and Democrats and independents, but they fought together and died together, not defending a red America or a blue America, the United States of America. And it's like, and then it's like, oh, I mean, he didn't really say anything there, but but it was beautifully put.
I'm 100% for that.
Yeah, the message was great. And
great
and look,
message.
he also was very critical of the George W. Bush administration's excesses. And I'm going to end the war in Iraq. I'm going to reinstitute habeas corpus. We're going to end torture. There were a lot of, he didn't do any of that. I mean, I guess he ended the war in Iraq eventually and then reinvaded the country because the ISIS fighters he was arming invaded the country. But then I think essentially what happened, and it was around Obama's re-election campaign, this is where things really went off the rails in this country, was that he got in there and continued and expanded all the worst of the Bush policies.
Oh, of course.
And so they almost had nothing to run on. And so they decided to pivot to a culture war instead.
So as I was saying in the prior segment, similarly to how the Catholic Church was corrupted as hell prior towards the Reformation in the 15th, 16th century, the authors of the book The Information Age, Sovereign Individuals, seemingly make the same case. The church in the 15th, 16th century had total control. It controlled land, agriculture, commerce. It sold indulgences. It became extraordinarily corrupted. And the same dynamics, according to the authors of that book, are occurring today, wherein you have governments in the nation states who are extraordinarily corrupted. There are no checks as such on power. And this is why you have figures such as Billy Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi. Nancy on a salary of $100,000 a year. She's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's unbelievably corrupted. And this is why, as we'll discuss momentarily, you have this populist undercurrent, this idea that something is not quite correct within society. And you have the people, you, having a voice, saying that this is wrong. And Nancy Pelosi, as we'll see in 1 second, has recently called out populism at an Oxford debate here in the United Kingdom, when she stated that it's a threat to democracy. We'll speak about that within 1 second. But the point that I wanted to make about the prior analogy of the 15th century church prior towards the Reformation and the current day government is that the printing press revolution altered the dynamics of power massively, wherein it dismantled the prime monopolies that the church had upon information, which was a fundamental feature of how they controlled society. The printing press disseminated information and led to a revolution. It dismantled the prime monopoly that the church had upon information, upon scripture, upon knowledge, upon laws. Similarly, I think you can make the same case today. The changing dynamics of technology are fundamentally altering the prime monopolies that institutions held. For instance, we can see, especially in the case of media companies, large-scale media companies, nobody likes these guys anymore. They don't trust them. Why? Well, because through new dynamics of communication upon dissemination of information, we can now interact and communicate and speak about things in different ways, which previously was impossible. The same is true with governments. As the clip highlighted there, we can now hold our politicians to account in different ways, wherein previously that was not necessarily possible, because we were fed information from media organizations who held a monopoly upon the information. We saw during the pandemic, for instance, that politicians in the United Kingdom and around the world, they were setting the rules and they were not following the rules. Of course, this is going to lead to a populist undercurrent when you have this level of corruption. It's unbelievable. So this brings us, as I was saying earlier, to Nancy Crooked Pelosi, as Trump would call her, wherein Crooked Pelosi seemingly was in the UK and she spoke about populism at the Oxford Union, wherein she stated that populism is a threat to democracy. And she stated that populism is bad, and it's a threat, and it's bad, and it's exploitative, and all this stuff. She spoke for, about 20 minutes, and she didn't really say much in Nancy's fashion, but she just spoke about how populism is apparently so bad. And then you have this man called Winston Marshall, who debated against Nancy. He was opposing her views. And Winston was stating that actually populism is not bad, it's part of a democracy. And it tells you something that is fundamentally wrong. It tells you about this undercurrent that we have amongst a large swath of the general populace, wherein this populace, this group, this demographic, they are unhappy with this state of affairs. They don't feel represented. And thus there is this new populist kind of undercurrent that is gaining more traction. Winston Marshall went on to say, against Nancy Pelosi, said it straight to her face. He went on to say that the elites, in his own quotes, have renamed, populism as a kind of a derogatory term against those whom they disagree with. Populism, according to Winston Marshall, is very synonymous with kind of, a derogatory terms such as racist or theorist. If you say you're populist, it's a smear. And what is very surprising, honestly, and Winston Marshall similarly reiterated this in the debate against Crooked Pelosi, Marshall said that he was actually very surprised that Pelosi was arguing in favor of banning populism, because his understanding is that the left is supposedly meant to be anti-elite, but instead the left seem to have shifted entirely in favor of the elite, in favor of large corporations, for instance. We saw this, as I've argued, in the pandemic, wherein the left were not skeptical at all about large corporation or large government. They seemingly showed no concern or skepticism or criticism of large corporations. It was instead almost this universal unanimity between the political left and large corporations, with no questioning whatsoever, which shows you, I think, the peculiarity of our current political climate. So Marshall went on to say, to finalize, that populism is the voice of the voiceless, and it shows an undercurrent within society, highlighting that, according to Winston Marshall, the real threat to democracy, according to Winston, as he argued in the debate, is the political elite. And so, linking back to the clip that we listened to at the start, interesting things are happening in our political climate, and politicians no longer have any moral backbone, and there is this real populist movement that was exemplified through Trump, through Brexit, for instance, and the general skepticism around the events over the past few years, which is very, very interesting.